Yes, thank you for joining us today for the luncheon with our very special guest, David Mark, who's a senior editor at the Washington Examiner. And moderating our luncheon today is Dr. Robert Browning, director of the C-SPAN Archives and professor and faculty director of the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement. Dr. Browning, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, David Mark, thank you so much for joining us from Washington, D.C. to West Lafayette, Indiana. Your career, as by way of introduction, has seen the evolution of media, currently at the Washington Examiner, but you're a senior editor at Politico, and CNN Digital Politics. And I'm sure you've seen prior to digital politics. You've also are deeply into the video library, I think, when your books are called Going Dirty, The Art of Negative Campaigning and Dog Whistles, Walkbacks and Washington Handshakes, Decoding Jargon, Slang, and Bluster of American Political Speech, co-authored with Chuck McCutcheon. So you appear regularly as an analyst and spoken in many countries. And I know you're very familiar with the video library, and so we'd like to welcome you to our C-SPAN conference. And sorry we don't really have a lunch. I'm sure you've been to many virtual lunches already where you have to get by drinking your water. And but go ahead and give us a little background on what you do and how the video library might affect what you do.
Well, thank you, Professor Browning, and hello. Well, first of all, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. I've learned over the last year and 8 months or so to always check, because you just never know in these presentations and everyday discussions how the sound and technical aspects are going to come through. But glad to see everybody, and I look forward to everybody's questions and the discussion. As Professor Browning mentioned, I am in the Washington, D.C. area from my home in suburban Maryland, just outside the nation's capital. And it's a thrill to be joining you, even if remotely. I very much miss the days of being able to do this kind of thing in person. It's so much better to be able to interact and hear you can hear voice inflection, but see facial expression without masks and just have a direct conversation. But we will keep on going, as we all have been for the last year and a half plus, and hopefully we'll be through all these health risks soon enough. The C-SPAN video library is just one element in my overall longtime reverence for C-SPAN. I became a fan of, let's say, a C-SPAN junkie back in college when my roommates thought I was rather weird for watching House and Senate floor sessions while they were watching music videos. And I'm dating myself here, but this was in the early months of 1993 at the start of Bill Clinton's presidency. So I had followed that campaign very closely. And then afterward, I just kind of continued on watching House and floor, new president. I became enamored of the floor presentations, particularly in the House. My good friend, yield my time, that sort of thing. And I continued watching Washington Journal, the flagship public affairs morning show, which it continues on to this day. And really it's C-SPAN generally that made me want to move to Washington and build a career as a political journalist. I toyed with the idea of academia. Ultimately, I settled on becoming a journalist and kind of being in that milieu and being able to see all these folks that I'd seen on C-SPAN so many times. And it ultimately became my honor to appear on the network a bunch of times when I was at Politico, in my current role, when my books came out, including an hour-long Q&A interview with Brian Lamb that aired in November 2014. And that was a real career highlight, just being able to do that and sitting down, and also the way the producers kind of cut to the ad. There was so much video available for some of the points my co-author and I had made in writing, and to see it illustrated. So it's very well produced. And I'm not somebody who's usually particularly an early adopter of technology. I'm not a Luddite per se, but I'm probably about average when it comes to the latest version of the iPhone, Amazon command device, et cetera. But I am proud to say that I began using the C-SPAN video library pretty early on. I can't say it goes back all the way back to 1987. I was just a freshman, I think a freshman in high school at that point. But as soon as I got interested in politics and politics on the web, and as Dr. Browning said, my career kind of follows the trajectory of politics online. So I was able to kind of see it in its earlier incarnations and watch it whenever something happens. And I'm proud to say that I use it really in my daily work, both for my job, my day job, and in freelance. And I had an opportunity to do that just this morning when sadly the news came across about the death of former Joint Chiefs Chairman Colin Powell, of course, the former Secretary of State as well. And I didn't have a lot of time to go through the videos after the news broke this morning, but it was actually really fascinating just looking at his first appearance on C-SPAN, which was on November 5th, 1987, when he was named National Security Advisor by Ronald Reagan. This was the shuffle when Caspar Weinberger left as Defense Secretary, Frank Carlucci moved, then the National Security Advisor moved up, and that made Colin Powell the first African-American in that position, and actually relatively rarely as on command duty general, active duty general. That's not usually how it goes in those positions. That was only 2 minutes longer, so he just got a brief speaking role at the end. I thought it was kind of just evocative of his career and his prominence as he grew. The next, there was a bunch more, but one that I actually do remember was the Panama Panama invasion in December 1989 to end the regime of Manuel Noriega. And he's standing there with then Defense Secretary Dick Cheney. And it was interesting. That's kind of a prelude to what we'd come to know in the Gulf War, starting about 8 months after that, and really through January, February 1991, where these guys became kind of national stars. And it's just really interesting to see that trajectory. And that's just a kind of real-time example, if a bit sad in this case, when a public figure is in the news. And I want to kind of know how they came to be. What did they look like in their earlier incarnations? What did they say? How were they treated? Or were they addressed differently by their peers, by their commanders, their superiors at the time, et cetera, their underlings? And it's always fascinating to do that. And something that I've had the chance to do for many of our congressional leaders over the years, including for now House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the Democrat from San Francisco, from California, who has been in Congress since June 1987, when she won a special election to fill that seat. And her first C-SPAN appearance came on September 30th, 1987, at a House subcommittee hearing on prenatal care. An important topic, to be sure, but not always the most dramatic for congressional hearings. But she appeared, Nancy Pelosi, then representative, or only known as representative, she still is one, but she's also the House Speaker, third in line for the presidency, appeared at the 1837 mark. And then also one a few years before that, March 9th, 1983, that caught my eye. This is a debate on Social Security solvency. This is about what would come to be the agreement, the kind of compact between President Ronald Reagan, House Speaker Tip O'Neill on the solvency of the Social Security program, which was getting ready to go broke at that time. And one of the early speakers in that debate is first-term House member Dick Durbin, a Democrat from Illinois. He had been elected to the House just a few months before in November 1982. He moved up to the Senate in 1996, and he is now the Senate Majority Whip, the second highest ranking Democrat after Chuck Schumer, somebody who's a very recognizable face on television and a pretty prominent C-SPAN character as well. He's got many videos over there. So I don't know if we're able to actually play that here. If not, it's easily viewable on my file under my profile to watch. I don't know if I click it, if it will work here.
No, you'll have to share this.
No. Okay, I'll have to share it. It's easy enough to,
Yeah.
It's easily accessible there. I promise if you just watch those. But what stand out to me are a couple of different things. One with Speaker Pelosi in that video is that she's not the same person that we're used to recognizing here. She's talking, for one thing, about a prominent policy issue, something that she still does as speaker, but you don't see her in the role of national party leader the way that we do today as House Speaker, and really the role she's been in for 20 years now, since she was first elected House Minority Whip 20 years ago. She was House Minority Leader for 12 years. She'll have, assuming she stays throughout the term, she'll have been Speaker for 8 years. Usually when you see Speaker Pelosi on C-SPAN now, she's speaking about what bills are going to be brought up to the floor, what amendments, what the national strategy is for trying to get President Biden to sign the bills, or in the last Congress, President Trump, who is very much a rival of her, shall we say, to put it mildly. And it's just very interesting to watch how they've kind of evolved over the years. And with now Senator Majority Whip Durbin, he's speaking there in what was very much an older House of Representatives. It really strikes back to a previous era. If you watch it, there's, if I can put it bluntly, it's not the most diverse place out there. So there's a lot of gray-haired guys in three-piece suits, some of whom on this floor have been speaking, were around since the New Deal era, like Claude Pepper, the former senator from Florida who became a House member, who introduces him, or William Natcher, the presiding officer. Pepper had first been elected to the Senate in 1938, and Natcher, during the Eisenhower era, I believe it was a special election back in 1953. So that's one thing where we could really see, I think, a lot of evolution and progress in how our Congress has gone. It's much more diverse, not as much as it should be. That's a whole other room for a whole other discussion on that another day. But that was also a time when Democrats really dominated the House. That was in 1983. So that was about 3/4 of the way through Democrats' 40-year run in the majority, where Republicans were, at best, supplicants kind of off to the side, no real role in policy making. And that really comes through just in the speeches are given, how they're addressed, et cetera. It's also just interesting to me to note that these were the initial appearances by these now national figures, but you wouldn't have necessarily known it at the time if somehow you had been watching C-SPAN at the time. Pelosi, Representative Pelosi, is one of the last people addressed kind of at the end of the hearing. I think she was at that point the most junior member of the House, or one of them. And Durbin was just a freshman in Congress in a big freshman class. And I kind of liken it to sports figures who didn't exactly emerge on the scene, or it's not like former President Barack Obama, who made a national splash with his speech at the 2004 Democratic National Convention in Boston, where overnight became a national figure. I like it more to, say, Hank Aaron, the eventual home run king, who actually in his major league debut in April 1954 for the Milwaukee Braves went 0 for 5 in a loss lost by his team, the Cincinnati Reds, or future NFL Hall of Fame quarterback Tom Brady, who made his debut in November 2000 during the third quarter in a game his team, the Patriots, lost 34-9, and nobody really thought these figures at the time were going to become giants. So you never know who you're watching on C-SPAN today could become the giants in the coming years, and it's always fascinating to me to watch, to see who you think could be there. Some of them surprise you, stay on for years and become committee chairman. Others are gone after a term or two and don't really become national figures. Something else I've always enjoyed from the C-SPAN video archives is being able to do screenshots and tweet out notice interesting figures and occurrences that have come up. One that I found was prominent public officials in their first appearance. One, I suppose you might say, is not too surprising. Joe Biden, as just was mentioned in the previous segment, when he was a senator, of course, 36 years, a Democratic senator from Delaware. And his first C-SPAN appearance, which is in a screenshot of a tweet that I have in my file, was on April 20th, 1983 at the annual Democratic Congressional Dinner, basically a fundraising dinner. And this to me was interesting because it was more than 3 years before C-SPAN proceedings went live in the Senate. Of course, they started in the House in March 1979, but the Senate were slow adopters. So it's always interesting to see, for me, to see senators during that interregnum period when usually they come at areas like this. It was either a fundraising dinner, occasionally Senate hearings would be televised. Ironically, there's one in 1981 about the prospect of televising television hearings, and to see some of it is rather prescient what they predict. Some of it doesn't come true at all. It's rather fascinating to me. Another one that I found interesting goes back to January 6th, 1981, 40 years ago, a little over now, which was the counting of the Electoral College votes in Congress, which until this year, I think even most of us who follow Congress, political science, politics pretty closely, it's not something we gave a whole lot of thought to. It's the kind of thing like when your car is running fine until it's not, it needs a tune-up, oil change, then you have to think about it. You pay a little attention to it, you get it fixed, and you move on. But since we had, sadly, the Capitol insurrection and the effort to interrupt a free and fair election, I tweeted a few months later after this clip had kind of gone viral, quote, one of Walter Mondale's finest moments, which I admittedly had not seen until this January, until the head of the losing presidential ticket challenged the results. And this, of course, was after the ticket of President Jimmy Carter and Vice President Walter Mondale had been smashed by incoming President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, or George W. Bush as he was known then. And Mondale had to sit there and announce his own loss, a position nobody would like to be in, but it's what you do as a statesman. And until, sadly, this year, we all just took for granted. I actually watched Al Gore do this in 2001 as a reporter, and vice presidents of both parties have had to do this. It's not fun, but what you sign up for when you go into elective politics. So I frequently use screenshots of C-SPAN video archives material in tweets. And one other aspect that I wanted to touch on, this is a little bit more futuristic, forward-looking before we get to questions and answers. I very much look forward to that in the time we have left, is that usually I'm pretty impartial. Don't like to give my personal opinions on substantive issues, but one area in which I will venture forth an opinion is hoping that someday in the future, hopefully not too distant future, the C-SPAN video library comes to include Supreme Court arguments as well. This is something that all the sitting justices of the Supreme Court have rejected, some more vehemently than others during their confirmation hearings. But I think it's something that we're inexorably moving toward. They already have audio of their most prominent cases, and Supreme Court justices seem to be a little bit on the defensive these days, that some of the rulings are being overly politicized. That's a whole other discussion panel for another time. But I think we're getting there. It's also interesting that the top Senate leaders on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Dick Durbin, aforementioned, who in addition to being majority whip, his leadership role chairs the Judiciary Committee, and Chuck Grassley, Republican from Iowa, who was first elected in 1980. They are both on record for televising Supreme Court hearings. And I was hoping that at some point we'll be able to do that, because after all, these are funded institutions that I think should be televised just as much as Congress. But a lot to chew on there, and I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, questions, and anything else.
Okay, very good. Let me ask you to lead in one other evolution that I know you've seen. If you ever saw Brian Lamb in the early days, he had a stack of newspapers.
Yes.
He would hold up the newspapers on television, and that was and he brought journalists in to talk about their stories and the events of the day. So what do you see in your career and in the video library and the evolution of journalism? And what do you see? Where do you see that?
Yeah, I'm probably a good example, case study in that I grew up on print. I started my career reading print newspapers and still do, but a lot less so. Well, I'd say into the early part of last decade or so, in which I kind of resisted reading long articles online. And I always found it if it was something like from the Atlantic or the New Yorker, or even a long newspaper story, a couple thousand words, I found it really difficult to read online. For better or worse, I spend so much more time online. I've gotten more used to it, adapted to it, and just stared at it. It means a lot less clutter in my own place of having fewer newspapers around. I'm not sure it's entirely positive development, but I think it is just the way it's going in terms of how journalism is delivered. In some ways, it actually has been positive, because I think it's forced a lot of writers and editors to get to the point more quickly. And I think there was a lot of news reporting that simply took too long to get to the point. And it's kind of a cliche now that we all have short attention spans, but I think it's always been like that. We're all busy. And I think you really have to get to the compelling points. So I think it has forced journalists to be more direct about what they have to say. There are drawbacks as well, that you can't paint those kind of vivid pictures and read a long form article on screen. I still print them out. I generally take the Metro to and from work now that we're going back to the office. If it's a long article like that, I like to have it and then read it on the Metro, or I was just on a flight yesterday, save it for a time like that. So I think generally it is positive because it's allowed for more news to come out, but it's not without its drawbacks. We could spend a lot more time discussing that one.
All right. Who's got a question for David? Oh, I see two of them here. We'll go to, I forgot your first name, Dr. Bleen. Go ahead.
I'm Sherry.
Sherry, yes.
I do not know why it says Dr. Bleen. I'm Sherry. May I ask my question?
Sure, go ahead. Definitely.
I love this presentation, and I'm looking for a comment. What do you think of the recent decisions concerning interruptions regarding Supreme Court arguments?
Interruptions in what sense?
Having to do with the likelihood, and I emphasize likelihood, that interruptions are more frequent and more freely exercised when women are speaking.
Oh, by the interruption by the justices themselves. Okay. I'm not a Supreme Court scholar, so I haven't studied how it compares to the male versus female justices. Okay. My understanding, just having followed the court and talked to former clerks and people have covered it, that the justices say that the oral arguments are kind of the cherry on top of the dessert. The real convincing part come with the briefs, the written briefs that they get and read in advance, and the oral arguments probably have less sway. I have no idea of knowing if that's rather true or not. There are 3 female Supreme Court justices now, so I'm not sure I have a good answer. I'd actually like to see an empirical study on that to see if there are more, if there are less. It is interesting. Justice Clarence Thomas seems to have spoken up a lot more in recent years for whatever reasons. And I read one piece that suggested it was when they were remote during the pandemic, he thought that was a better setting for doing it. But I'd want to look at that a little before without speaking too on it, because it's not quite my area of expertise.
Yes, Clarence Thomas, and it was a different method. They would go serially through the justices. And I think he felt that, that was his time to speak, where in the current setup, they just interrupt. And so it's the more vocal who are like Scalia was and the others are today that get to speak. Allison, we got another question here. Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation, David. My question for you is talking a little bit about the ability of integrating the C-SPAN archives as evidence into reporting, and sort of just speaking, if you could, to the value that having something that you could easily link to a video in your own writing provides, versus a lot of other journalism that requires you to say, oh, I talked to this person and they said this, versus this sort of evidence-based ability that the archives provides.
Yeah, it's invaluable. This is the kind of thing that the late Tim Russer, the host of Meet the Press, would do, where I don't know if they were necessarily C-SPAN archives, but he would point to a city elected official. So you're saying this now, but 10 years ago, you had this other view. And that's the kind of thing that I really like to do, where you see, let's just say members of Congress of both parties are not known for their consistency and have on occasion been known to engage in legislative hypocrisy, where they're one procedural thing when they're in the majority, something else for in the minority. I've done this kind of thing many times, this kind of story many times on the Senate filibuster, where you have Democrats now who are urging changes, abolition of the filibuster, or at least some serious changes to it. But when they were in the minority, they used it as an argument for protecting minority rights. That's a whole other discussion. There's meritorious arguments on both sides. Republicans, the same thing. I think it's probably a lot more hypocrisy on the Republican side, particularly now in terms of counting electoral votes, or what some of them were saying about disputed elections. So I find it I'd say I use it most consistently when elected officials are being inconsistent and when they seemingly have different views. But I could spend almost any day, I could find some topic in the news and find a good way to refer back to it. And I'd say that's one of its most useful aspects, to really be able to say what they've said, or in other cases, they've honestly evolved. In some cases, you do have lawmakers who had a position on abortion rights earlier in the career, it's changed for whatever reason, or many other issues. You have former, say, House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff, Democrat from California, who is now known as a stalwart Democrat and is vehemently criticized by Republicans. He actually voted for the Bush tax cuts in 2001 when he first got into office. And now he denounces the Trump tax cuts. And it's interesting to see some of the different arguments. And you can find plenty of Republicans. That's not to be partisan. That's just one that came to mind off the top of my head. So absolutely invaluable.
All right. Joshua, you want to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, David, for not only your time here in the session, but also for everything you do in terms of reporting in your history. So I find it interesting, the argument about getting increased media presence for the Supreme Court, right? And I guess I hadn't thought of it that way, but this came up in an earlier panel where we were talking about the history of Congress and its averseness to technology, and it took them a long time to adapt these technologies in congressional hearings and to accept that they should do that. And now we're seeing it being very, very much utilized. I understand why the Supreme Court is hesitant. I guess as a researcher, I like that I can view this from afar and analyze it, but you're more in the thick of it. Could you speak to maybe or elaborate more upon, do you see that as happening? Do you see the Supreme Court as eventually kind of being pushed to accept media into these deliberations, or do you see them holding out for a while? And what impact that would have on both your job and also kind of what material might be available then for us researchers to delve into through something like the C-SPAN archives?
Well, the biggest argument against it is that it would change the nature of the proceedings, that you would have lawyers, advocates preening for the cameras and trying to get sound bites. I'm skeptical of that argument because they want to win the cases ultimately, and justices have life tenure. I think it might be rather boring to a lot of people in interstate commerce type cases, which is actually the bulk of what the Supreme Court considers their docket. I think that argument has some merit. I think ultimately, though, as I mentioned, in my opinion, it's a taxpayer-funded institution, and I think the reason I think you will have more justices being open to it is just because they're going to come along in the coming years, those who are more tech savvy, say Justice Amy Coney Barrett, she's 49 or 50 years old. You know, if she actually grew up with the internet, she's probably reasonably internet savvy and has an idea what Twitter is. I mean, I have no idea. I'm just, this is all conjecture, but has an idea what technology is versus some, shall we say, the more senior justices who still write out in pen and pad. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but 15, 20 years from now, there will be rotations on the Supreme Court. I think you will have justices who will just understand it's sort of the zeitgeist and the milieu of the age in which we live. And I think ultimately there will be lawmakers who pressure them to. Ultimately, it's Congress who controls the budget of the Supreme Court. And there have been a few efforts over the years. Arlen Specter, senator from Pennsylvania, when he was a Republican and chaired the Judiciary Committee, I think it was in the late 1990s, he made a push to basically defund the Supreme Court if they wouldn't put cameras in the courtroom. It didn't work. This has cropped up a few more times, but I just think it's one of these issues that's going to get inertia. It's going to pick up. When that's going to happen, I don't know. I hope, but I think the real reason justices don't want to be televised is I don't even think it's so much about the arguments. It's they don't want to be recognized. They like being public figures with still being fairly anonymous. Most of them, except maybe people like us, would not recognize them in a grocery store the way that you would Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, because they're not on television all the time. And I think they like to keep it away. That's sort of what I've heard anecdotally from former clerks and journalists who cover the court and whatnot. But hope, it's a hope, but not exactly a forecast. I'll leave it at that.
All right, we got another question. Another question from Allison. Go ahead, Allison.
Hi there. And again, thank you so much for just the generosity of your time and all of your comments today. I'm also, like Dr. Browning, really interested in the development of political journalism. And I would love your comments about how the capacity of members of Congress or any political official to bypass the press through social media platforms and whatnot has transformed the role of the political journalist. And I would just love your thoughts on what does it mean to be a journalist now that the people you're covering actually can speak directly to the public themselves through these social media platforms?
Right. There's always been versions of this going back to franked mail, as old-fashioned as it sounds, but it's still done. Each member of Congress gets a mailing allowance. And there was always this way of kind of going around the public. Now that's directly to constituents because you can only send to people in your district. Now, if you want to be in leadership or you build a national profile, you do it on social media. And I think it's both a concern, but I'm not overly worried about it, in that you'll have members of Congress basically speaking to their base, their own Twitter followers. If you're Republican, you're probably going to go on Fox News, and that's where the base is. My experience, though, is most of them still want to be national figures, and you can't really do that by just ignoring the media. And I think that strategy really only goes so far. And it's something that we have to be concerned about. It's not just Congress either. It's the White House does this. They have their own photo operation. This is very a little bit tangential, but I think it makes an important point. The Obama White House, for all its praise of him being open to the press and answering questions, actually did a lot to cut out national journalists and try and talk more to local reporters. If there was an initiative they were trying to get a vote, they'd go to the local station in Philadelphia or Detroit or Reno, Nevada, or whatever it might be. And so I think it's part of a broader effort of what politicians do. One trick that it's not exactly a trick because it's open, but one thing that I like to do is actually subscribe to the newsletters of each individual member of Congress. that go to constituents, they try to make these not really accessible to journalists. It's one of those digital things where you have to jump through a bunch of hoops, like identify how many squares have cars in them or crosswalks or whatever. You have to give your name. It's almost like signing to a bank account. They clearly don't want it to be accessible by law. They can't just close it off either. It's publicly funded. And usually they don't go much beyond talking points that members give in public, but occasionally you actually do get something interesting, like when they're holding a town meeting that maybe they don't want publicized to the news media because they don't want journalists to come in. And you get, especially during the time of COVID-19, during the pandemic, most of them are teletown meetings. And so you can call in, you can't get barred at the door like you might in a physical town meeting. So I try to see what they're actually telling constituents rather than what they're saying in public. And yeah, occasionally they make a few other announcements that is a little bit at odds with what they're saying. A good example of this is say with the stimulus program, the COVID-19 related program that passed earlier this year when President Biden first came into office. Lots of Republicans voted against it, yet they were willing to take pride in individual provisions that benefited their district. And I remember this going back to the 2009 stimulus bill, which all congressional Republicans voted against. And then they go to ribbon cutting ceremonies in their own district when a new bridge was introduced or something like that. So I think the role for journalists is just, it's pretty basic. Watch what they do, not watch what they say, and try and find end runs about how they're giving out information.
Okay, anyone else have a question for David? Let's see if I see any hands here. So,
Actually, I do, Robert.
oh, go ahead, Andrea. Yeah, go ahead.
So David, this is going to take you back to the beginning of your career, but when did you really start integrating the C-SPAN video library into your work, and how have you found it's changed you?
It's a great question. Must have been, I'd say, came to Washington first back in 2000, and I think I started using early versions. I know it'd been around since 1987 at that point, but to me they were relatively early incarnations of it. I think I started doing it to learn who members were and just learn more House floor style now that I was covering the House of Representatives. And I think it's changed me most that I've gone back to quoting what members said, and not just members, but all kinds of public figures, going back to the beginning of their careers and trying to, as I said, trying to find those inconsistencies. And I don't even mean that in a gotcha way, like, oh, you said this here and here's something else. But sometimes lawmakers do evolve. Another aspect of that is around redistricting time, which we're facing now, where House districts are being redrawn. Sometimes lawmakers get quite different constituencies that they have. It might be more liberal or conservative or something in between, and they have to emphasize different issues. Or say when a House member moves up to the Senate, I often like to look back at what they've done, like Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who replaced Hillary Clinton as the Democratic senator from New York when she was appointed in 2009. She first was elected to the House in 2006, and she represented a relatively rural upstate New York. I think it's like between Albany and Utica, somewhere up there, where gun rights are pretty big, and it's not exactly, you're not exactly in Manhattan. It's a real different part of New York. She had a rather conservative voting record on a bunch of issues, and then she went statewide and she became real liberal real quickly. And so it's interesting for me to compare speeches she would give earlier in her career. And again, nothing wrong with that. Elected officials adapt. She's just representing a different constituency. That's the generous interpretation of it. But that's something I always like to do when somebody goes national. And even watching, I heard this reference in the previous panel, when Joe Biden, when he was a senator, going in 1994, and even before that, to the degree there are clips, it's fascinating to hear what he was talking about, and how you could probably spend days trying to find what he said then versus what he's saying now as president. And I'm sure there's probably dissertations to be written about that. So I just trying to see how lawmakers evolve, I think, is probably the longest term use that I've had for it.
So what do you see, since you're there, we're here, what do you see going on right now? How's this thing gonna kind of sort out between Schumer and Pelosi and Biden and Manchin and Sinema?
Well, my own guess, and it's only this, but having watched Congress go through a number of these deals, I called it an informed guess or informed speculation. They will reach some kind of deal. It's kind of like too big to fail at this point. Even Joe Manchin, Senator from West Virginia, Democrat, I don't think really wants to see the Biden initiative fail. I don't think Kyrsten Sinema does either. And I think a lot of the speculation sort of about her motives and operating style is a bit off, and that I actually agree with these elected officials are not ideologically on policy. They're pretty savvy political operators, and say Kyrsten Sinema made it from the state house in Arizona to the U.S. Senate with a stop in the U.S. House in between in a dozen years or so. It's pretty impressive. She must have some idea what she's doing. And Joe Manchin's been an elected official in West Virginia. I was governor, secretary of state legislator before that. I think he knows the state pretty well. I think the problem Democrats have had and continue to have is expectations. They let the left flank of the party set expectations sky high. We hear now about a 3.5 trillion spending bill on human infrastructure. Originally, Bernie Sanders and some of the House Progressive Caucus members were talking about 6 trillion or something in that range. It's a similar problem to what happened during the Affordable Care Act debate 10, 11 years ago, in which expectations were sort of set by the left part of the caucus. I'm not quite sure what you do about it, but now it's going to seem like a disappointment to whatever ends up getting passed. I think they have a kind of a year-end imperative. It's a cliche, but not a lot of legislating gets done during election years, although there's plenty that has in any election year. It's not like they do nothing, but they have much more of an incentive to get it done before year end. So I think they'll get something, I would say, maybe a tick over 1.5 trillion. Still a lot of money. There's a lot of ways to slice and dice these programs where everybody could call it a win if they're each willing to step back a little bit. Also, I would just say about Joe Manchin, it's often queried if he'll switch parties or not and become a Republican. That's usually more from people on the left. I would say no, because if he does that, Mitch McConnell is majority leader again, and Joe Manchin is just one of 51, I should say. And he's not even the most important. Now he is a kingmaker in every sense of the rule. And so I don't think that's going to happen. Also, Manchin, if you look at his voting record with President Biden and even, frankly, President Obama and against President Trump, he's pretty much a mainline Democrat. He's with the party the vast majority of the time. Now, you could argue that's self-selecting, that they only bring up votes where they know it's going to pass. So that's not always the best representative example, but it gives you some idea that he really is kind of an old-fashioned New Deal Democrat who believes in the power of the federal government to do good, kind of in the Robert Byrd mold. Just West Virginia's changed politically, and he's pretty savvy not to talk about it in those terms all the time.
Okay, very good. Any other questions here for David as we wrap up? We got just a couple minutes left in our luncheon. Here you're eating your desserts. I don't see anything else. Anybody else that wants to ask questions? So any final thoughts for us, David?
I look forward to seeing how the video archive evolves in the coming years. I tuned into a little of the tool, the session before. It's actually really a question. I might have some follow-up technical questions on how to slice and dice some of these and get more specific videos that I'm looking for, specifically in the longer house sessions where you're looking for one member, something like that. But that's a whole other discussion. But I'm looking forward to seeing how it evolves and what else gets included in it in the coming years. Excuse me, that's my phone ringing. That's modern technology. I don't know if you can hear that or not, which I will ignore.
All right, well, let's wrap up here. Andrea, I'll turn it over to you to do the logistics. And let's all thank David for joining us in a busy time in Washington, and we really do appreciate your insights today.
Thanks,
you.
everybody. And I'm available on email. I always happy to discuss anything follow-up individually as well.
Okay, very good.